Of Jill Scott's Coffee Club. Coming up next on 5 Live, it's Formula One. Ricciardo returns, De Vries departs. It's all change at AlphaTauri as the Australian is back in F1 and back with the team he raced at 10 years ago when it was called Toro Rosso. So what does this mean for Sergio Perez? Time will tell. I'm Rosanna Tennant and this is 5 Live Formula One. We'll talk about the ruthless nature of Formula One very shortly, but alongside me for the next 25 minutes or so is the former Renault F1 driver Jolyon Palmer and the BBC's chief F1 writer Andrew Benson. And there is so much sport going on at the moment, guys. Andrew, have you been watching the Ashes or the golf?
I've been stuck to 4 hours of press conferences today, Rosanna, I'm afraid.
You live the life.
Yeah, I was expecting you to have all the screens on, keeping tabs on everything, but so it's just press conference for you?
Yeah, Formula One drivers all the way. Yeah.
What about you, Jolyon? Anything going on? I know you love the tour.
I've been all over the tour. I'm all over the tour, but it's sort of coming to an end now, and it's been for the last couple of days, so... It's been great, and now it's Max Verstappen level of dominance to the end.
Oh, yeah. Gosh.
The tour has turned into Formula One, hasn't it, Joey?
It was so good, it promised so much, and ended with a big gap.
Well, it's slightly different to Formula One then, because I'm not sure it promised that much at the beginning, but Max Verstappen, with a huge lead out front, now has 99 points over his teammate Sergio Perez. And in the Constructors, Red Bull have a 208-point lead over Mercedes. So now that we've covered how the championships are looking, there is only one place to start the show, and that, of course, is the headline that Daniel Ricciardo is coming back to Formula One. He'll be in the AlphaTauri car from this weekend, replacing Nick De Vries. Was this inevitable? Andrew, have you known about it for a little longer than perhaps all we have?
There have been rumours for a while, and I think it started to look bad for Nick De Vries when Helmut Marko, the Red Bull Motorsport advisor who basically decides the driver choices, when he came out and said that Christian Horner had never wanted to sign Nick De Vries in the first place. And when you heard that, you thought, ooh, this is not good. Then he didn't improve his performances over the next couple of races since then, and then when Ricciardo was down to do the Silverstone tyre test after the British Grand Prix, that looked like bad news for De Vries, and it's turned out to be because Ricciardo went really quickly in that test. So they say.
Lap 11, wasn't it? That's when Helmut Marko supposedly gave Daniel Ricciardo the seat, or at least told Nick De Vries he didn't have the seat anymore. Jolyon, watching on as a former F1 driver, should Nick have been given a little bit longer? I mean, Daniel's now got 12 races to prove his worth. Nick was only given 10.
I have to say, he is also a really smiley guy. So they've actually swapped out one smiler for an even bigger smiler at that team. But what was commendable for Nick was that he was smiling through what was a really tricky season. And the 10 races he's had, they were just not great. And he was signed with a bit of a fanfare by AlphaTauri. You know, he was a man in demand. End of last year, he came in for Williams, got points on debut, was pretty mega in Monza. Had quite a lot of experience in Formula One cars with Mercedes powered cars all of last year. Was Formula 2 champion, Formula E champion, and he was signed to lead that team. He was supposed to be filling the void left by Pierre Gasly, and he just hasn't in 10 races. Now, the thing for rookies is very tough, the start of the season, because the way that the calendar is, there's a lot of street circuits, there's a lot of circuits that you don't know coming into the season as well, even if it's not technically a street circuit like Melbourne or Montreal. They're tricky tracks, but he's not picked up even in Barcelona, in Silverstone and Austria now, and he's not looking like he's getting any stronger. And let's not forget, he was brought in to be showing Yuki Tsunoda the way, and it has been quite clearly the reverse.
That's right. I mean, he's only out-qualified Tsunoda twice out of the whole season so far, and on average he's been about 0.17 of a second behind Tsunoda's pace in qualifying. Now, I think it says as much about Tsunoda, or at least it says as much about Red Bull's perception of Tsunoda as it does about De Vries, because, as Jolyon said, they wanted De Vries to lead the team. They saw him as an experienced pair of hands, even if he wasn't experienced in Formula One. He had driven a lot of Formula One cars over a period of time. He was Mercedes reserve driver for a couple of years, did some free practice sessions for various teams. And if he was 0.17 seconds on average behind Fernando Alonso or Lewis Hamilton or Max Verstappen in his first 10 races, then Red Bull will be over the moon about that. But it's because it's Tsunoda. And I think it says that Red Bull don't really rate Tsunoda, even though everyone thinks Tsunoda's doing a better job this year than he has over the last 2 seasons. Because it's like saying, well, he's 0.17 behind someone we don't think's that great in the first place. We know Tsunoda's not about to get a Red Bull seat in the future, I don't think. So it's not that great for Tsunoda either, and it's obviously probably the end of De Vries's career. But what it does mean for Ricciardo is he's got to come in and blow Tsunoda away if he's going to get what he wants, or what Christian Horner says he wants, and what Daniel Ricciardo said today he wants, which is back into the Red Bull, which he voluntarily left at the end of 2018.
Yeah, and that's the difference, really. That's the difference, because you've got Oscar Piastri, who's been behind Lando Norris pretty well this season, but everyone rates Norris really, really highly. And actually, Piastri has done very well to be just nibbling away at the heels of Norris and be very close, as we saw at Silverstone. Sargent has been similarly distant as De Vries, but he's way more inexperienced. He's a complete rookie. He's much younger. De Vries is 28. Tsunoda's 23. And if we were sitting back, as we probably were at the end of last year, and we were talking about, who were the best drivers, but also who struggled the most last year and who needs to really up their game, we probably would have said someone like Tsunoda. He was beaten by Pierre Gasly. He was under a bit of pressure. Now, he has raised his game immeasurably. He looks like he's come on leaps and bounds. He's having a really stellar season, but that's in reference to a teammate who's underperforming. So it's that balance of, is Tsunoda now really solid, or is De Vries was he just a little bit weak? And that's what we're going to find out with Ricciardo coming in. And De Vries' best result was 12th. Tsunoda has had 2 top 10s. Could have had 4 top 10s as well, with Monaco and Barcelona just getting away from him. So it just shows there was quite a big gulf, and Ricciardo's going to have to step on it.
Well, I guess the big question is then, Christian Horner is now saying that he spoke with Daniel Ricciardo in Mexico last year to slightly tee up this third driver role at Red Bull with him. Why didn't they just move aside Nick De Vries then and just put Daniel in the AlphaTauri at that point, if the ultimate goal is a Red Bull seat for him in the future?
So Ricciardo didn't want that. At the end of last year, he was saying he only wanted to come back to Formula One in a top car. And at that time, you thought, well, who's going to give you a top car after you've just been trounced by Lando Norris for 2 years? He's had a few months away. He's reset. He says he's fallen in love with Formula One again. And I think by taking a step back, he's got some perspective on what happened to him over the last few years, particularly at McLaren. He basically sounds like he'd lost confidence. And of course, but the question is, it's one thing to say that, it's another thing to prove it on the track. Now, he's obviously gone really well in that Silverstone test. Otherwise, Red Bull wouldn't have put him in so quickly. But he's now got to live up to what he did in the best car in the field, in the second worst car in the field. Everyone's going to be really interested to see how he gets on.
And here's the elephant in the room, Sergio Perez. If Perez was performing, this wouldn't even have happened, I don't think. I think De Vries would see out the season. I think there would be no rush to put Ricciardo in to see exactly where he's at after leaving McLaren in those tough years. But it's because Perez is underperforming quite substantially at the moment. His qualifying record is woeful right now. His race pace is okay, but his teammate is wiping the floor with everyone. And Red Bull don't know if next year they're going to have this march on the field again. So they want a second driver who can be much closer. And with this gap, they're obviously looking at the management and thinking, can we get someone to be closer to Max and be a more efficient second driver, which Checo's not doing at the moment? And that is where they've looked back to Ricciardo. And Daniel will obviously know, there's my chance. With Perez underperforming, if I come in and nail this, I will be back in the Red Bull.
Yeah, and Horner said in his interview with F1 Nation podcast earlier this week that Max and Checo are our drivers for next year. No one believes that at the moment. Red Bull have history with this. They swap their drivers around whenever they fancy it. They're all on the same contract effectively. So as Jolien says, everyone in Formula One is looking at this with realism. If Perez carries on failing to get into the top 10 in qualifying like he has done for the last 5 consecutive races, which is appalling for someone in one of the best cars in history, and Ricciardo does really, really well in the AlphaTauri, there's every chance that they'll swap them round at the end of this season.
Well, let's hear how Daniel Ricciardo is feeling then, fresh from signing a contract to drive with AlphaTauri for the rest of this season and maybe beyond. He sat down with F1's Lawrence Barretto before heading to Hungary.
It's good. It's really good. I enjoyed, this, call it 6 months off, and I think it was really good for me. But the more kind of races I started to attend, the more sim I started to do, certainly getting the bug back. And then jumping in the car a few days ago, I was like, oh yeah, it all felt very normal.
Okay, so you signed for Red Bull as a third driver. To explain to everyone, how have you gone from that to in an AlphaTauri seat, replacing Nick de Vries for the Hungarian Grand Prix?
You have to ask them. I just, it's all. Look, I've been part of, obviously with a little interval, or not an interval, a little intermission the last few years. But I've been part of the Red Bull family for so long, and I know that these things can happen. So even though I was sure taking some time off this year, I was always, in the back of my mind, I knew maybe I will get a call. And of course I was on standby for Max or Checo as well if they're unwell or unfit. So I was always staying ready enough. And it's an unpredictable sport. So just staying ready at all times, I guess.
So I want to know what that call from Helmut Marko was like. You've had those calls before. Many a Red Bull driver has had one. What happened when his name popped up on your phone?
I was like, okay, let's just hear what he has to say. I think that's probably the best thing, because sometimes you're trying to prepare yourself. What if he asks me this? What if he? It's let's just hear him out and see what happens. And I was like, okay, and I didn't really need to think much about it, in terms of, I think as well, being back in this family, I feel so much. I feel like I'm kind of just going through it all again. And these were the calls that, I used to get, and this was kind of the moments that they used to kind of throw in front of us. So there was no question that I was going to say yes. It was just, I guess the reality of, okay, it's going to happen pretty soon.
You mentioned that familiarity of being back at Red Bull. I know that when you left Formula One, you maybe fell out of love a little bit when you left as a race seat.
Sure.
How have you found that love again? Has it helped, I guess, being back in the Red Bull family?
Definitely helped. And I think as well, the falling out of a bit of love with it was also, took a hit on my confidence. And then, of course, if you're competing, in a sport where you're trying to be the best at something, best in the world at something, it's obviously you need full confidence, full belief, all of it. And when that starts to, diminish a little bit, I guess the enjoyment then starts to drop as well. So there was just a lot of factors. And then getting back to Red Bull and kind of the reception I had walking back into that team was really kind of just, in a positive way, a little bit overwhelming. And then getting back on the sim, I was still a bit unsure how I was going to go, if the car would feel like it used to, and if I was going to be, for lack of better words, like the old me. So once I'd done a few sim sessions and, started feeling like myself again, it then just kind of brought me back to normal Daniel, where I was, falling back in love and ready to go again.
They're in a bit of a different spot to when you were with them last time. They're struggling a little bit towards the bottom end of the Constructors' Championship. What are your kind of expectations there?
I think it's really just for me to... I'm not setting anything, the car will be what it is. I'm going to drive it and then work from there. I don't want to get too much preconceived ideas. Mm-hmm. Is that right?
Yep, preconceived, yep.
So, I appreciate the car's going to have its limitations. It's, I'm sure they're probably just lacking some overall downforce and things like this. But I think if it's a car that feels balanced, it might not have as much grip as a Red Bull I drove a few days ago. But if it feels relatively balanced, then that's something I can work with. But I'm looking forward to also developing it and using my experience. But ultimately, I think for Budapest, just go out and have fun. Just try and use more right foot than left and have a good time. What
have Red Bull said, expectation-wise? You're obviously on loan from them to AlphaTauri. What have they said you've got to achieve?
just be a legend, really.
Easy. Done.
They expect results, performances. It's hard to define. I think until I get in the car, it's hard to define what that is. Is it a P8? Is it a P14? I don't think there's pressure for, until the summer break. Obviously, there's 2 races and then the summer break. I don't think you have to do this before August. But yeah, I also don't expect to get off to a slow start. I want to hit the ground running and try and, also use what I've learned in this time off to put it to use.
So that was Daniel Ricciardo talking to Lawrence Barretto. And I guess there are 2 schools of thought. He has got nothing to lose for the rest of the season because the car is really difficult. And he's got everything to gain because, as you say, Andrew, if he does really well in the car, he's going to put pressure on the powers that be at Red Bull to replace Perez with him. But what is a really, really good result for Daniel Ricciardo in a pretty difficult AlphaTauri car?
He has to beat Tsunoda. If he doesn't beat Tsunoda, he's toast. For the whole of Formula One, not just for Red Bull. That's it. He might keep the seat next year if he doesn't beat Tsunoda, but even that's not likely because they've got a few drivers on the sort of edge of Formula One, like Liam Lawson, who's racing in Super Formula at the moment, as what is one example. If he beats Tsunoda, everything's to play for. Not just for the future. We don't know that Red Bull will definitely put him in instead of Perez, but they could. They might keep him at AlphaTauri next year, or there's not really a lot of other seats available to him at the moment. But his career is revived only if he beats Tsunoda.
Well, I'm really excited for it actually because Daniel, I spoke to him at the end of Abu Dhabi last year, and he was looking forward to getting away and just not thinking about racing for a while. And you could tell he was a man that had had a really rough couple of seasons and was just a bit deflated with it all. He's obviously had 10 races away and he's just thought, I want to be back out there. I've got so much more to offer. And that's really nice to see. And it shows he's going to come back in with a bit of fight and he's got something left in him to prove. And there was a lot of unanswered questions from him last year because we know he's a great driver and he was just having such a torrid season. He has to, as Andrew says, cold hard truths from Benson is basically right. He has to beat Tsunoda. I think in the first couple of weekends, he can be level with Yuki. He can be quite close. But as the season goes on, quite quickly, he has to be the guy that gets the job done there. And this is a car that kind of, at the start of the season, Tsunoda was 11th, 10th. There were fringe of points every race. And if you put 3/10 on Tsunoda for a megastar driver, you're getting consistent points out of that car. And that's what Ricciardo's aim has got to be. The last couple of races have fallen a bit further back, but Ricciardo's aim has got to be to show some flair in that car. Even if he has to stay at AlphaTauri again next year, then he'll be in a position to replace Perez at some point if Checo doesn't get a move on.
I'm replacing long run corner with cold hard truths corner with Andrew Benson from now on.
They've been there for years, Rosanna, the cold hard truths with Benson.
Well, the sad...
He's speaking from personal experience.
Yeah. Oh, far too long.
Exactly. Oh, dear. And unfortunately, you're only as good as your last race. And of course, for Daniel Ricciardo, that was Abu Dhabi last year. 9th place, being beaten to the checkered flag by his teammate Lando Norris, who finished P6. So... into the points this weekend? Is there any chance? A lot of people are going bold with predictions.
Well, I think it's an open question, isn't it? Because at the moment, the AlphaTauri statistically is the second slowest car in the field, and it's only just faster than the Alfa Romeo. There's nothing between them. But that's with Nick de Vries and Yuki Tsunoda in it. If you put Lewis Hamilton in that car, it's probably half a second up the road, Then it doesn't look so bad at all. So can Ricciardo bridge that gap? Can he make that car look better than it has done so far this season? That's what they'll be hoping at Red Bull.
And how quickly can he do it? That's the question. It would be helpful for him that he had that day in the Red Bull after Silverstone, just to dust off the cobwebs, get a bit fresh again. It's a physical circuit, driving Silverstone. The amount of G you're pulling there is a lot higher than it is in Budapest. So physically... I hope he's in good nick and he should be after that. So then it would just be dialing into a new car and maybe slight tweaks to driving style potentially, depending on the settings. But yeah, I wonder how quickly he can do it. I've just got a feeling he'll be right there with Tsunoda straight away.
Of course, he knows how to win at the Hungaroring, won back there in 2014. And sticking with the Red Bull theme, let's talk about the records then this weekend, because Red Bull could break an F1 record that stood for 35 years. Verstappen's victory last time out at Silverstone moved Red Bull onto 11 consecutive wins, matching McLaren's tally from the 1988 season. And if they win this weekend, they'll hold the record outright with 12. Now, this gets chatted about a lot. The drivers get asked about records and record breaking. I don't think Max Verstappen is worrying about setting a record. He said earlier in the press conference, which I know you were glued to, Andrew Benson, that he just wants to win. He doesn't want to win to break a record. But they seem to be in control and they're bringing upgrades this weekend. And Max saying that they're going to make them faster in the corners, which at the Hungaroring is pretty handy.
They've actually had a lot of upgrades this season already, Red Bull, even though they've been claiming that they haven't. And all the other teams are going, what are they saying? They've had no upgrades. They've been bringing something virtually every race. This record thing, it doesn't feel quite right to me because McLaren did it in one season. Whereas Red Bull, you're counting the last race of last season into it. So they're probably going to break the McLaren record anyway, even if you start counting from the start of this season. But it's an imperfect statistic, isn't it, when you're going across from one season to the next, I think, anyway. And
all F1 stats are, though, aren't they? There's no perfect F1 stat. There's more races now, so you build a dominant car, you can win for 23 instead of 15 races or whatever. What's amazing to me is that, forget the 12 races, they have won for an entire calendar year now, minus one race in Brazil. That Brazil Grand Prix skews all the stats. Because if you take out the one that Russell won in Brazil, they have won everything, every race for a year, since Austria last year, where Verstappen finished second. That's bonkers.
That is domination.
Two different cars.
It's the most dominant ever, really, isn't it? Probably. I mean, maybe Mercedes in the 50s. This is more dominant than Mercedes were through 2014 to 2020, you could argue, I think. Certainly in terms of the statistic that Jolene's just quoted. I'm sure Christian Horner would find a way to argue with that. But anyway, it certainly feels that way at the moment. They've done an absolutely incredible job. It's a brilliant, brilliant car. And Max Verstappen is driving it superbly. Fernando Alonso was saying only a couple of races ago he thinks Verstappen's on another level from everybody else at the moment, and he looks like it. But it would be nice to see some pressure put on him, but it doesn't look like there's going to be any pressure put on him for a good while yet.
Yeah, they are leagues ahead, and I imagine on Sunday evening, Andrew, your headline might be Red Bull break a record. Or maybe not. Maybe you don't.
Have you written it already?
I might as well, Jolene, mightn't I? I'm at the point where you go, right, Max Verstappen won, what else happened?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Well, that is a big question.
Churn out the first couple of paragraphs already.
Exactly, yeah.
Verstappen takes a dominant, lights to fly victory.
Exactly.
Insert race title and go again. But that's the big question, isn't it? It's P2 and back. And of course, P2 in Silverstone was Lando Norris in the McLaren. So the big question, are they back? Or is it too difficult with the track-specific element, the upgrade, the Lando factor, although Oscar was obviously there just off the podium in Silverstone. What are we saying? Are they back, here to stay? Are they now the lead chasers, would you say? Or is it still Mercedes, Aston Martin and Ferrari as well?
I think they're in the pack now, aren't they? They've bought upgrades and they're in the pack. But it's so close, that pack, that one weekend they could be the lead chasers again. One weekend the track will suit Ferrari more, it'll suit Mercedes more, maybe Aston Martin, although they appear to have slipped back just slightly in the last couple of races. Hungary shouldn't, in theory, suit McLaren as well as Silverstone. The McLaren were so fast in the high-speed corners at Silverstone, and it really transformed their car. They made gains in the low speed as well, but their high speed was way better than the Mercedes and the Ferrari. And Silverstone is full of high-speed corners. Hungary isn't. I'm looking at Spa for McLaren, and I think that could be a big chance for them to get back to their Silverstone level of performance. I still think in Hungary, though, with their upgrades, they'll be in the mix, but maybe a bit more like Austria than like Silverstone.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything Jolene said about McLaren. I think they'll slip back a little bit in Hungary, but still be better than they were before Austria. I think that the person who probably finished on the podium maybe at the head of the teams behind Red Bull is Fernando Alonso. I know Aston Martin have had a difficult couple of races in Austria and Silverstone, but that car's terrific in slow and medium speed corners, and he's brilliant around Hungary. I think they're going to return to form, and actually could suit Mercedes a bit more this weekend as well. Their car's a bit better in the slow and medium speed corners, but then so's the Ferrari. So, but I've just got a feeling about Alonso and Aston Martin. I think they'll be more competitive again this weekend, and back to where they were before Austria.
So, Benny, you've put your sort of stake on Fernando Alonso being on the podium this weekend. What about P3? Do we even envisage a Ferrari venturing towards the top of the standings this weekend, guys?
Well, it's hot in Hungary, so the chances of Ferrari doing well in the race are probably not that good, even if they qualify quickly. Yeah, tyres melting, exactly. Although they said after Silverstone that the reason they slumped so badly in the race to 9th and 10th places from quite close to the front on the grid was that they were over careful with the tyres in hindsight, they thought. But Carlos Sainz was also saying today that he thought that some of the problems with the car are still there, that there's sort of inherent problems, and one of those problems was overusing the tyre in the races, and the last two races haven't been that warm, and this one is going to be. I think Lewis Hamilton's always good in Hungary, so I think he'll be in the mix too, and Perez needs to be for his own sake, because if he's not, then I think there's the questions that they're already asking at Red Bull privately, not publicly. They're supporting him publicly. They're just going to get louder. What
about you, Palmer? Who's on your podium? Daniel Ricciardo venturing up there?
Nope. But what seems if he was. I see Hamilton coming up to the fore at a track he's always been good at. George Russell was on pole there, took his first pole last year, let's not forget. So I can see it being Mercedes and Ferrari fighting it out in qualifying in Hungary. Maybe with a Fernando Alonso having some decent race pace and see if he can put on some moves or a different strategy to come through. But I could see it. Let's go with a Hamilton-Leclerc podium.
Ooh.
I also saw some thunderstorms predicted until the end of Saturday. At least that's what it says on my smartphone weather app. So
always trusty.
Yeah, the weather park nearby, isn't it?
Well, actually, you know what? Through the 80s and 90s, Hungary, it was always hot. It was like always hot and dry, and that's what you expected. But over the last decade or so, it's increasingly begun to be hit by rain on one of the days. Actually, if you look back now, it's quite common that there's rain at the Hungarian Grand Prix. So I wouldn't be surprised if the famous software company that's got the weather on my phone is right this time.
It's the new Malaysia, isn't it?
Yeah,
exactly.
When you're going to Malaysia and you're like, every day looks like every hour of every day is thunderstorms, and you're thinking this is going to be an absolute deluge. How are we even going to race? And then you turn up and it's bone dry, apart from 1 hour where there's the mother of all storms come down. That could be Hungary.
Yeah, it sounds like it could be a good weekend. Thanks very much, guys. Andrew Benson and Jolyon Palmer helping me look ahead to the Hungarian Grand Prix this weekend. We are now out of time, but we'll be back tomorrow where you can catch all of the sessions on the BBC Sport website. And then on Sunday, you can hear the race in full at 2:00. This has been an IMG production for BBC Radio 5 Live. Next up, it's Casa Alom. But first, let's get the latest BBC News here on 5 Live.